This is the story of the rise and fall of one of the industrial giants that made Britain great. 200 years before the phrase was invented, it was one of the world's first industrial complexes with quarries, coal and iron ore mines, coking ovens, blast furnaces, forges, railway and canal networks, brickworks, factories and even farms, all in and around the town of Ripley in Derbyshire. The Butterley Company produced iron and steel, made steam engines and bridges for the world, built St Pancras Station and a host of important engineering products and structures. It made bricks, was one of the biggest colliery owners in the UK, and at its height employed 10,000 people. Its story is also the story of the entrepreneurial Wright family, who for over 100 years owned and controlled the company and influenced the destinies of Ripley, the Amber and Erywash valleys and their people. Before the coming of the Butterley Company, Ripley was just a small village with cottages and farms around a village green, and Codnor Park was a hunting park in the valley of the River Erywash. Most men were agricultural labourers, while women either worked in the stocking-making trade or as domestic servants to the local gentry. By the late 18th century, the educated middle classes were becoming fascinated with the scientific discoveries of the day and their financial possibilities. It was the age of enlightenment, and the Erywash Valley, with its abundant reserves of iron ore, coal and limestone, was ripe for development. Iron had already been smelted in the hamlet of Loscar since the 16th century, and Richard Arkwright had already opened his first cotton mill in Cromford in 1771. In 1790, in the reign of George III, two men, Benjamin Outram, a 26-year-old local surveyor and canal pioneer, and Francis Beresford, born in Ashbourne Mansion of a wealthy landowning family, formed Outram & Co. A year later, they were joined by William Jessup, the most famous canal and civil engineer of his day, and John Wright, the first of the banking family that was to ultimately own and control what was to become the Butterley Company. The company built their first blast furnace in 1791 on Butterley Fields, on the line of the Cromford Canal, also being built by Outram and Jessup. By 1806, there were 3 blast furnaces. The company's first product was pig iron. When the furnace was tapped, the iron ran into sand beds to form ingots. The moulds for the ingots were attached to a main runner, and the name pig iron came about because the arrangement resembled piglets suckling from the mother sow. The liquid iron was also collected in huge ladles and cast into large sand moulds to form castings for Butterley's many products. The Cromford Canal was vital for the success of the fledgling company. Outram and Jessup, when building the canal under the Butterley Works, incorporated a unique underground dock in the tunnel under the blast furnaces. Known as the Wide Hole, it was double width, where barges could pass each other, and coal, limestone and iron ore from the local quarries and pits was craned up shafts and loaded straight into the furnaces. Finished iron products would then be dispatched on canal boats and transported via the rivers Trent and Humber worldwide. From the start, the company realised the value of advertising, with leaflets and newspaper adverts promoting pig iron bars, pipes, boiler plates, steam engines including houses and all materials, weighing machines for turnpike roads with a person to fix it, and 2 types of cannon for the Royal Navy. The company also started making bridges, wheels and rails, and domestic items like railings. To start with, Butterley made rails where the wheels ran on an L-shaped plate. Later, Jessup introduced the edge rail, the forerunner of the type used today. An example of a horse-drawn gang road using Butterley's L-shaped plate rails was the nearby Denby Gang Road, which carried coal between the collieries around Denby. At Little Eaton, the company's innovative thinking led to wagon bodies being transferred by crane onto barges an early form of what we now call containerisation. Making small and large diameter pipes for the domestic and export market became a major part of their early success. These were used for town water and gas supply systems and for drainage pumps in mines. Gas pipes excavated in Stamford were still in good condition after 111 years underground. By 1814, the company had become a major employer. Workers' and managers' houses were built on 7 acres of land alongside the works at Butterley and at what is now known as Hammersmith. The nearby Butterley Hall had also been purchased for Benjamin Outram, and on his death passed to William Jessup and his family. Earlier, in 1794, land with valuable coal and iron reserves alongside the Cromford Canal was put up for sale. Realising the potential of the land, Outram, Jessup, Beresford and Wright quickly bought the lease and by 1809 had commenced to build a foundry, forge and offices, as well as workers' 2 up and 2 down houses on fields 3 miles to the east of Butterley at Codnor Park. By 1819, the works were producing annually 2,000 tonnes of pig iron, castings and wrought iron bar. A 1930s aerial view of the works shows the eventual extent of the site. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, poor harvests and widespread unemployment led to poverty and dissent across the country, leading to riots, and locally, at Pancras, a march to London to overthrow the government. This march was led by a man named Jeremiah Brandreth. He and 400 revolutionaries from Pancras, South Wingfield and surrounding villages, marching en route to Nottingham, arrived at the company's gatehouse to recruit more men and raid Butterley's stock of pikes and muskets. They were met by company manager George Goodwin, whose actions diminished Brandreth's stature in the eyes of his followers, leading to men drifting away from the march. The rest carried on to the outskirts of Nottingham, only to be arrested and executed or deported. Arguably, Butterley and its manager may have reduced the impact of what could have become a revolution. After the death from a stroke in 1814 of William Jessup, Jessup's son, William the Younger, became the junior partner to John Wright. They continued to expand the company, winning important contracts such as London's Vauxhall Bridge, the first iron bridge over the River Thames, as well as bridges in Lincolnshire, the Gumpty River Bridge in Lucknow, India, and even the cast iron colonnades in front of London's Haymarket Theatre. On the retirement of John Wright in 1830, his son Francis took over as senior partner. William Jessup's brother Josias was also a brilliant engineer and was appointed consultant engineer for the Cromford and High Peak Railway. Butterley gained the contract for the rails and stationary beam engines, one of which is still in working order at Middleton Top near Wirksworth. 3,300 tonnes of rail were supplied for the 31-mile-long railway, which carried goods and passengers from Whaley Bridge to Cromford for over 100 years until the 1960s. By 1824, annual production of 5,000 tonnes of pig iron, together with increasing demand for household coal, forced Jessup and Wright to lease more land and sink further coal mines, making Butterley one of the largest coal producer and distributors in the Midlands. By the 1830s, the Butterley Company was valued at over £2 million at today's prices. Demand for its products were at record levels, and the steam age was dawning. Jessup Jr. and Francis Wright were determined to profit from the railway mania that was sweeping the country. Jessup Jr., although a first-class engineer, preferred to concentrate on iron making, and with Francis Wright controlling the company's finances, and with the faithful George Goodwin as works manager, they appointed a series of chief engineers to carry the company into the steam age. Between 1808 and 1880, 5 eminent engineers held the position of chief engineer. Brunton, Miller and Glynn were primarily steam engine designers. Brunton established fitting shops for the manufacture of steam engines, and Jessup Jr. described him as a very ingenious machinist who was for many years with Boulton and Watt, and now has management of steam engine manufactory here. Butterley built a steam locomotive in 1813, 16 years before Stephenson's famous rocket. However, Brunton and Butterley concentrated on designing and building big, powerful marine engines, being renowned for steam dredger engines used on the Caledonian Canal, the Trent and Humber, and the ports of Bristol and Shoreham, also powering the first Liverpool ferries in 1814. Brunton received recognition from no less than the Royal Society in London for his inventions. However, he is remembered mainly for his mechanical traveller or steam horse. At the time, there was a misconception that the weight of the locomotive would be insufficient to grip the rails when pulling a load. Brunton designed a locomotive propelled by a pair of steam-driven legs. It travelled at just 2.5 miles per hour and was used on the Cryche Quarry tramway, with a second supplied to a colliery in the northeast. Unfortunately, its boiler exploded, killing 13 people. After Brunton left Butterley in 1815, Miller continued to design bigger and more powerful engines, with higher steam pressures and lower coal consumption, such as the engines used on the incline of the Cromford and High Peak Railway. The next engineer to arrive at Butterley was Joseph Glynn. He carried on the work of his predecessor, designing and manufacturing even larger 200 horsepower marine engines. Several of these engines were designed and shipped out to the Baltic for the Russian Navy, and over 150 other steam engines were exported to the Empire. He also improved working conditions and insisted on education for his workers and their families. Glynn also designed iron roofs, heavy machinery and sugar mills, which were exported to the East and West Indies, America, Europe and the colonies. However, he and the Butterley Company became famous for their part in draining the fens around Cambridge, Spalding and Ely, a total of approximately 90,000 acres. Much of the success was due to the Butterley designed and made large steam-driven scoop wheels, with engines developing 80 horsepower. An engine, built in 1831, is preserved at Streatham near Ely as a tourist attraction. A total of 17 Butterley engines and scoop wheels were built for this nationally important project, and similar drainage schemes in Holland and Germany, some working up to the 1940s. Butterley's wrought iron was sold to the shipbuilding and construction industries, with much of the Menai Straits Bridge being constructed with it. Brunel's Great Britain, launched in 1843, also used Butterley wrought iron in its construction, the durability of which can still be seen on display in Bristol Dock. Jessup the Younger, the junior partner, devoted his entire life to the company. He was renowned as a talented inventor, registering several important patents. He was also very popular with his workers, always taking their needs into consideration. As a hobby, he bred dogs and could be seen walking his dogs around the works and Butterley Hall. He retired in 1851 and died a year later after a long illness. Out of admiration and gratitude, the workforce and locals paid for memorial windows in Ironville Church, as well as erecting a monument to him at Codnor Park. At his funeral, there were many tributes describing him as much missed, the most active character ever sustained by a man of business, instrumental in maturing many of the great projects that astonished the world, and the iron house that is Butterley Company has lost her governor, and the workmen their father. After Jessup Jr. died, Francis Wright soon became the sole owner of Butterley Company, which remained in his family's ownership and control for over 100 years. He was a very devout man, concerned about what he saw as the low morals of his workers. Believing that the devil finds work for idle hands, he saw making money for the company and himself as means of improving the life and morals of his workers through his and their hard work. With Jessup Jr., he provided the money to build the well-ordered, self-contained model villages of Codner Park and Ironville. Good quality terraced housing with gardens, schools, shops, social clubs and churches were all provided and mostly still exist to this day. Local Butterley farms provided fresh food, and a workers' educational institute with its library, lecture hall and coffee room encouraged learning and self-improvement. Harrow and Bonn University educated Sir John Alleyne became Butterley's chief engineer from 1852 to 1880. He was an inventor and innovator, and with Butterley's workforce, he oversaw Butterley's most famous achievement in the second half of the 19th century, the building of London's St Pancras station. Often described as the cathedral of the railways and one of the wonders of Victorian engineering, its arched roof was designed by William Barlow. At the time, it was the world's largest single-span structure. It was commonly known as Barlow's train shed. The lower floor, or undercroft, now used as a shopping area, consisted of 720 cast-iron Butterley columns supporting the train tracks above. Back in the 19th century, the lower floor was used to store beer barrels delivered by train from Burton-on-Trent. The erection of the superstructure, both by Butterley's own erectors and local labourers, used 25 wrought iron ribs, all made at Butterley and transported by rail to form the 240-foot wide arch. Each arch was put in place by using two large timber stages, each moving separately on rails. Each stage contained 25,000 cubic feet of timber, and when moving the arches into place, weighed 650 tons. Now, thanks to the regeneration of St Pancras as the terminus for the Eurostar, the full glory of Butterley's incredible station roof can be seen and admired. Probably the best known of all Sir John Alleyne's many ideas and patents was the Butterley bulb beam. Until his invention, there was a limit to the depth of iron beams or girders. He invented a process where two beam sections could be hammer welded together in the rolling process to make beams or girders up to 3 feet deep. Butterley bulb beams were used for floor joists, bridge girders and deck beams for the new ironclad ships. Many were used on the Royal Navy's warships, perhaps the most famous being HMS Warrior, recently restored and on display alongside Nelson's Victory in Portsmouth. Having its mines, foundries, workshops, brickworks and quarries in a compact area gave the company a unique advantage over its rivals. The company was a self-contained industrial complex. Its workforce were within walking distance of their work, and with its network of railways, its raw materials and finished goods were easily and cheaply transported by more than 20 locomotives and 1,500 wagons between sites and onto the main line. There was even a timetable of train services between the works at Ripley and Codner Park, and less than 10 years after its invention, the company had a telephone system between its sites. Butterley's growth led to a massive increase in the population of Ripley, Codner Park and Ironville. By the mid-1800s, nearly 10,000 people either worked for Butterley or were dependent on it for their livelihood. The company had turned a rural backwater into thriving communities with full employment and, for the time, good wages. Each worker had a terraced 4-bedroomed house with free coal and a garden. He was free to join a trade union and could look forward to a small company pension. The company provided a sick club with access to a doctor and medicines, ran a savings bank and built schools, although they still employed children as young as 6 in their mines. It was not surprising then that it was reported that 30% of the population could not read or write, and half the children did not go to school. The company also organised day trips for its workers and families. An 1864 report in the local paper talks of the low charge and the fact that work was stopped induced nearly 3,000 people to have a long ride and a sight of the sea at Liverpool. The arrangement seemed to have given the greatest satisfaction. The sea, which many had never seen before, made strange sport of some, making them feel very queer and sick. The model village and the company were praised in a government report. The masters showed the greatest interest in the well-being of their workpeople, and Ironville was declared to be the best example of a model village in Derbyshire. What the company didn't provide, Butterley's workers organised themselves, getting together in 1860 to start the first of the chain of co-op shops which came to be so much a feature of Ripley. By the mid-1840s, and with the death of Jessup Jr., Francis Wright eventually became one of the richest men in Derbyshire and the sole owner of what had become one of the greatest Victorian engineering companies. To reflect his role as a forward-thinking industrialist, he built for himself, his wife and 12 children, a magnificent and ultra-modern 70-roomed manor at Osmaston near Ashburn, where he lived the rest of his life as Lord of the Manor. Guests were welcomed via an imposing entrance hall to be ushered into spacious rooms, or if on business, escorted to the library to meet Francis. Its conservatory contained exquisite Butterley-made ironwork. All rooms were equipped with central heating, and there was a bakehouse, kitchen with thermostatically controlled ovens, and a laundry with one of the first spin dryers. The house had a laboratory and metal workshop, hydraulic lifts, an indoor tennis court, and a basement railway to distribute coal and supplies. Strangely, for a devout man, there was also a brewhouse. It was the largest and grandest manor to be built in Derbyshire since Chatsworth. A member of the royal household claimed the carved woodwork surpassed any in the Queen's palaces. Like other wealthy Victorians, he had a butler, Swiss governess, and 18 servants. Reflecting his strong Christian belief, Francis hosted religious gatherings and events for missionary societies and the local gentry. Nothing could have been more different from the lives of his Butterley workers and miners, with their simple 2-up and 2-down terraced houses and their £1-a-week pay. A kind man, but by today's standards a puritanical and sanctimonious one, Francis Wright commanded respect rather than affection. Despite becoming a Justice of the Peace and High Sheriff of Derbyshire, he never gave up day-to-day control of Butterley, driving his horse and carriage the 40-mile return journey to Ripley, often twice weekly. His enormous wealth and opulent lifestyle, and the humble life and relative poverty of his workers, he saw was something God had decreed. Only by his and their hard work, and by his workers forsaking drink and the devil and becoming devout Christians, would this ever change. The gulf between Francis's country mansion and life at Butterley was highlighted when a vicar Francis appointed to Ironville wrote of lurid flames shooting up from Butterley's blast furnaces, and the regular throbbing of engines with the crash of tremendous steam hammers keeps the parish always awake. The forgemen working by day and night, and the furnaces have not been extinguished for years. Life is hard. The process of puddling iron is so exhausting that 2 men have to work at each furnace. Long lines of cottages, all exactly alike in size and dinginess, are discernible through the smoke. Every cottage has a front garden, and many have a pig. Despite the intensity of the work showing on their faces, the workmen have a proud demeanour and an independence of spirit. No man is thought the worse of here if he never shows his countenance inside a place of worship. The company provides a Bible for everyone, a place of worship, and builds and maintains schools, and leaves the place to accept or reject its opportunities. Francis Wright got on well with his workers, and his workers respected him. However, as a zealous justice of the peace, he was lampooned for banning Ashbourne's famous Shrovetide Tuesday football game. Despite his extreme religious fervour, he became one of Derbyshire's most respected philanthropists, helping finance many churches and schools, as well as Derby's Nurses' Home and Long Eaton's Trent College. Such was his reputation that on his death in 1873, over 1,200 Butterley workers followed his cortege. His estate was divided up between his 11 surviving children. One son, Francis Beresford Wright, became chairman of the company, and another, Fitzherbert Wright, managing director. Francis and Selina's manor house was left to their wayward eldest son John, who sold the manor to pay debts he had incurred, and his father's magnificent manor house was eventually demolished in 1965. Butterley's output continued to rise. New state-of-the-art machinery was being purchased or made. The company's bridge yard built ever more bridges for the world's expanding road and rail networks, such as bridges over the River Maas at Dordrecht in Holland and Godavari Estuary in India, which were in their time engineering marvels of the world. In turn, the company's growth fueled Ripley's growth. Housing was built for the influx of new miners and Butterley workers. A local council was established. The commercial and shopping life of Ripley was centring on the newly built Grosvenor Road and Oxford Street areas. The Wright family, Ripley's main benefactors in the days before today's welfare state, helped pay for schools, churches, and the local hospital. The Butterley Company, in less than 100 years, had turned a sleepy hamlet into a vibrant industrial town. The company also changed. Sir John Alleyne, the company's brilliant chief engineer, retired, and Butterley became a private limited company. Local iron ore reserves started to run low, and to plug the gap, the company bought land locally and, in what proved to be a costly mistake, a loss-making foundry and mines near Newcastle-under-Lyme. In response to the Admiralty's demands for steel boilers, the company invested heavily in building a new steel manufacturing facility at Codnor Park. The end of Queen Victoria's reign marked a period of strikes, managerial dissent, absenteeism and drunkenness in the factories. Sir John Alleyne's autocratic treatment of Butterley's miners led to a month-long strike, with 11 miners shut out and sacked when, in Sir John's words, work had to be stopped for a week and one blast furnace blown with a great deal of trade lost. Butterley had many mines in the Ripley area. Most were small and outdated, and the miners worked in poor and dangerous conditions. Output was low, as were wages. Even the management called them rat holes. A local doctor's wife wrote after visiting the Butterley pit of
walking very low like under a dining table for hundreds of yards, and I pitied the poor pit ponies who only ever saw daylight for 3 days a year, and the poor colliers worked in shifts starting at 4 in the morning for 6 days a week.
Management mistakes and lack of investment led to the closure of Codnor Park steelworks after only a few years of production, and the Newcastle-under-Lyme works and pits turned out to be a financial disaster and were scrapped in 1902, a year which saw the resignation of Fitzherbert Wright as managing director. He handed the company to his nephew, Albert Leslie Wright, keeping the control and fortunes of the company firmly within the Wright family for another generation. Leslie Wright immediately set about reorganising the company. He appointed the highly experienced Euston Mitten as the company's mining engineer, tasking him with modernising Butterley's antiquated coal mines and brickworks. Eustace Mitten had inherited a series of outdated mines with diminishing coal reserves and antiquated equipment. In 1905, there were 19 shafts at Butterley's mines, hauling out just over 1 million tonnes a year. By the start of the First World War, Mitten's modernisation had increased coal production to nearly 3 million tonnes from just 12 shafts. The company's coal and iron production was quickly identified as being indispensable for the war effort, and in 1915 the government took over the company for the duration of the war to make munitions and materials for the war effort. Many men from Butterley joined up. Half the names of the dead on the Ripley War Memorial are those of Butterley miners and iron workers. After the war, coal reserves had run low in the Ripley area, and new coal seams were vital for the company's future. So in 1921, Butterley made their largest ever investment of, at today's prices, £60 million to sink a new pit on a greenfield site near Ollerton in Nottinghamshire. To keep costs down, the company designed and made most of the pit's infrastructure, from pit heads, winding gear, coal separation plants, to supplying bricks for the pit buildings and company houses. As 100 years earlier at Codner Park and Ironville, the company had to both recruit a new workforce and build a fully operational township with over 800 houses for them and their families. Every property was regularly inspected for cleanliness by the company. The front gardens had to be kept tidy, and anyone found walking on the grass would be fined. Both a brickworks and a hosiery factory were also built. The hosiery factory provided work for more than 600 women and girls. Montague Wright, the nephew of the managing director Leslie Wright, became the manager at Ollerton. A popular hands-on manager, he led the Ollerton mine to become one of the country's most efficient and, for the company, its most profitable coal mine, producing over 60 million tonnes of coal for Britain's hearths and power stations during its long lifetime. In 1926, a general strike was called and all Butterley's miners went on strike for better wages. A face worker at Ollerton was being paid 20 pence for each ton of coal he dug out. The lack of coke closed the forges for 22 weeks and many men were laid off. Conditions were so bad that soup kitchens were set up locally. 101-year-old Coxbench-born Arthur Deggy Bates remembers how difficult it was getting a job at this time at Butterley.
The foundry manager, he was tried. He wouldn't set me on. Well, 2 or 3 weeks after, I was speaking to a man in the boiler shop. I was asking him if they were setting on, and he said no, but the foundry was. I said, well, I've tried at the foundry and the foundry manager wouldn't set me on. He says, try Mr. Upton, the under manager, and he told me where and when Mr. Upton went for his dinner. And so I waylaid the fella. I asked him if there was any vacancies in the foundry. He said yes. Did I want a job? I said yes. He said, when can you start? I said, tomorrow.
Despite the depression and general strike, Leslie Wright was convinced that the company's manufacturing facilities should be expanded by building new foundries and construction shops to ensure the company's continuing growth. His foresight ensued major contracts and the new facilities were soon working flat out, making and erecting rail and road bridges, steel structures, and mechanical handling equipment for use throughout the country. The Codner Park works post-depression were fully occupied designing, patenting and making many of the railway wagons necessary to transport Britain and the world's goods and raw materials. In the 1920s and 30s, more than 200 wagons of all types were rolling off the production lines every week. Leslie Wright was a haughty and autocratic man who did not believe in fraternising with his workers. Arthur Deggy Bates had particularly strong memories of him.
Leslie Wright, in my opinion, he was an aristocrat, one of the old school. I never knew him look at a workman. Look at him. I never saw him look at a workman. Never mind speak to him. He used to walk through the yard, but I think the old gentleman had got his mind on other things.
Leslie Wright died in 1938, and his son, Fitzwalter, became the fifth generation of the Wright family to manage the company. In the mid-19th century, as demand for bricks nationwide increased, a permanent brickworks was built at Codner Park. However, it languished under poor management and primitive equipment. Recognising the nationwide demand for bricks after the Depression, Butterley expanded brick production by building the first of a series of modern brickworks at Waingrove, south of Ripley. On the outbreak of the Second World War, the company once again turned over its production facilities to the war effort. The company's foundries, workshops and construction yards produced anything from reinforced bar for the country's concrete defences to chassis for Bofors guns, tank tracks and turrets for Churchill and Cromwell tanks, mortar bomb casings, and even keels for frigates. A War Department film showed how the Codner Park's works was helping keep Britain's trains running.
Badly damaged railway wagons are sent into the works for repairs. They're examined by experts, the damage is assessed, and afterwards all the necessary new parts are collected. After this, the wagon repairer takes out all the damaged pieces and replaces them with new material until he's satisfied that the finished article is as good as new. Here are some wagons which have been repaired and painted, ready for transporting Britain's war goods to the numerous theatres of operation. An assembly shop for turning out small units is shown here. The parts are brought in from the various machine shops, put together and welded into working units, and tested for the high accuracy called for in this class of machinery. Most of the work is carried out by girls, with a nucleus of male supervision. All engineering works should be equipped with medical facilities such as at these works. Qualified doctors and nurses are in constant attention day and night, and all employees have the assurance that by reporting immediately to the medical attendant any accident which may occur, no matter how small, they will be better equipped to turn out arms and material for our fighting forces who are battling this raging war now upon us, and be healthy and strong citizens that Britain and her allies expect all their people to be.
And in 1944, Butterley made Bailey bridges and many of the components of the Mulberry harbours used in the Normandy landings. Also, during the war, the company became the agent for the assembly, sales and servicing of cultivators, binders, harrows and other farm machinery made by the Australian Sunshine Harvester Company. The end of the war saw the Butterley Company at its peak as an industrial giant. However, the nationalisation of Butterley's coal mines in 1947 signalled the end of the boom years and the start of the company's long fall from greatness. Butterley's pits generated nearly 80% of its profits, and it eventually received, at today's prices, nearly £100 million compensation for its 7 collieries. Butterley's pits were well run and the envy of the industry. George Ratcliffe, who started work at Butterley's Ormond pit in 1940, remembers the pride of being a Butterley miner.
I started at Ormond Colliery as an apprentice fitter on the 2nd of August, Tuesday morning, Bank Holiday Monday. We didn't get paid for them days for Bank Holiday Monday. As I said, I'll never forget my first day at Ormond Colliery. It was absolutely marvellous, and the gentleman I was with, he was a foreman, a shop foreman, and they were great. Really, it was a marvellous day. My first day at pit was. Yes, Butterley Company was one of the, I would think, one of the best employers locally. Yeah. They looked after local sports, the Codnor Miners' Welfare and Lusker Miners' Welfare, and took boys on the Boys Brigade. They looked after that and what have you. I couldn't fault them.
The Wright family had always had a paternalistic attitude to their workers. After all, it had been their company for over 100 years, and their workers mattered to them, and they found it difficult to sack workers. But times were changing. Codnor Park's iron puddling process had become obsolete. Its workforce was ageing, and there was no longer a need for wrought iron. Codnor Park's future was now in the balance, as were other ageing, overmanned and inefficient Butterley plants. On the other hand, the heavy engineering side of the Butterley Empire continued to be busy post-war, with its foundries being modernised as a result of new contracts for industrial diesel engine castings. The bridge yard was also busy, despite minimal investment, building bridges, overhead cranes and mechanical handling equipment to meet the demands of a Britain rebuilding after the war. The directors knew they had to use the millions received from the nationalisation of Butterley's mines to modernise and diversify, but the reality was that they only had experience of mining coal and making iron. Their problem was, what should they invest in? Back in the 1920s, Leslie Wright had seen the potential of Butterley's two brickworks. Now, armed with millions in compensation, the directors made investing in brickmaking their priority, buying brickworks at Ambergate, Denby and in Leicestershire, as well as building a state-of-the-art brickmaking plant near their former Ollerton pit. Under the inspired leadership of Frank Catchpole, they pioneered new methods and designed new equipment, increasing group production to nearly 5 million bricks a year. By the mid-60s, the future was bright for Butterley's brickworks. The directors also invested in the Butterley Farms, with an ambitious investment in state-of-the-art milking parlours, which quickly lost money. A joint investment with the US-based Air Products Company to build an oxygen plant in North Wales was to be another new and profitable direction for Butterley. However, Butterley had no experience of making liquid oxygen and undertook the investment on the understanding that the American parent company would provide its expertise to set up the company. This they failed to do, and the joint venture eventually failed, with Butterley withdrawing from the project. Another diversification was Aglite, a company set up to make lightweight sintered concrete and clay bricks for the building industry. Butterley opened a plant at Denby, being the first in the UK to develop new technology imported from America. Aglite products were initially successful and sold well, but the plant never made a profit and was closed to make way for an open cast coal mine. The directors' search for new ideas led them to license and build a vertical car park, which could store 40 cars in the space occupied by 3 cars at ground level. However, sales were minimal. Car owners did not trust them, and the planners believed they were a fire risk. This and other ahead-of-their-time projects proved to be bad investments, and an ever-increasing overdraft and disagreements between the directors reinforced the view that the company was rudderless and on the decline. To add to the loss of its mines and investment failures, in 1965, Codner Park's antiquated forge and rolling mills finally closed. On Butterley's board, the remaining Wright family member and managing director Monty Wright was joined by the young John Wright, son of Fitzwalter Wright. Having studied business management at Harvard, he wanted to reverse the decline by consolidating and centralising the many offices and management groups at Butterley Hall and focusing manufacturing on new products such as mass-produced mobile cranes. He also advocated raising capital by selling some of Butterley's land to build trading estates. In an interview, he describes the board's reaction to his plans.
I think what I remember was that I thought that we made the Rolls Royce of cranes for the steel companies.
Yes.
And, but there was a big market where the name Butterley would be a great selling point. And therefore we could build a new shop for mass-produced, high-quality run-of-the-mill cranes.
Yeah.
And they just said, absolutely no. And then they suggested really that it would be a good idea if I left.
Yes.
It's good for my soul.
Is it correct then that you went to see Jim Slater?
Yes.
And he recommended that the shares were sold and Hanson took over, or would take over?
Yeah. It was a remarkable experience because I went in to see Jim Slater and he asked me a few questions about the company and I gave him the answers. And then he said, okay, we'll do it. And I said, what? He said, well, we'll buy it. And I said, I thought, no board meetings, no plans, no investigations, just we'll do it. After 10 minutes conversation. And as we walked out of his office, he took me by the arm and he said, well, go on, smile, it's fun, isn't it? And that was Jim Slater for you.
Hanson took over?
Hanson took over, and the arrangement was that I would go back to run it, but the Butterley board, not surprisingly, were outraged
yes.
and furious, and they said, we will only agree the bid if you tell us that John Wright isn't going to come back.
Yes.
And so I was ditched the second time. I got 2 golden handshakes in a short time.
So your actions and selling shares, the rest of it, eventually, or really, ended 180 years of Wright's family control of a massive company. With hindsight, given the opportunity, would you have gone down the same route? Knowing how the company...
Yes, I mean, the great question was patience. And looking back, if I had been more patient and more diplomatic and waited, we had Mr. Winchcombe arrived, do you remember?
Yes.
And he started creating problems. And I just needed patience, I didn't have it. And that was the problem.
That was it, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In 1968, as a result of John Wright selling his majority shareholding to Jim Slater, who then sold them on to Jim Hanson, later to become Lord Hanson, the Butterley Company became part of the Wiles Group, which divided the company into Butterley Engineering and Butterley Bricks and Quarries. At the time there was a property boom. Brick making was highly profitable and Butterley Brick rapidly expanded and prospered, and when Lord Hanson incorporated Butterley Brick with London Brick Company, it rose to become the largest brick-making company in the world. Lord Hanson was less sure about the future profitability of heavy engineering, and in 1969 he sold the engineering side of Butterley to a small Leeds-based company called Oxley Engineering, thereby starting the takeovers, name changes, mergers asset stripping and company closures that ultimately led to the closure of the company. Within months, Oxley and Butterley Engineering were back in the hands of Jim Slater, being acquired by another Jim Slater associated company, Kent Castings, and integrated with the Lion Foundry, a small Scottish foundry at Kirkintilloch, famous for making Britain's iconic red telephone kiosks and letterboxes. Integrating Butterley's massive foundry with the Lion Foundry turned out to be a bad decision, as Edwin Greasley, Butterley's foundry manager at the time, explains.
Kirkintilloch had one customer, the post office. Well, it had two customers. Mainly, 85% of the work was for the post office. They made telephone kiosks, roadside cabinets, manhole covers, GPO on them. Butterley Foundry was a completely different entity. We had 100 customers. We made a whole range of cast iron, as you well know. And what Mr. Ken Roberts did was to put the man from Kirkintilloch in charge of the two. Butterley was completely alien to him. He wasn't. He couldn't cope with having that many customers and that many grades of iron and things weren't very good at all.
Things indeed were not very good. The company had, since 1947, lost its core businesses, its coal mines, the Codner Park Forge, the wagon works, its profitable brickworks, Aglite, and Air Products. The rump that remained, its heavy engineering division, was in the hands of unsympathetic asset strippers and speculators. Worse was to come when Slater amalgamated Butterley Engineering with Crittall Hope, a window-making company, and Adamson Alliance, a rival Telford-based crane-making company, to form a new company to be known as Butterley Engineering Industries Limited. While the mergers appeared to be good for Butterley and Ripley, with work being transferred to Ripley, asset stripping and downsizing at Adamson Butterley and Crittall Hope factories eventually led to factory closures and hundreds of job losses. In 1975, the company was again sold for a fourth time to Norcross, a company set up to acquire so-called failing companies. Renamed again, this time as Butterley Engineering Limited, it found that any name which included the word Butterley still opened doors of both government departments and private companies. The new revitalised company redefined and concentrated on selling its core products. And with new design and sales staff, the new company was soon picking up important orders. After the failures of previous years, the new company was on the rise, and its future started to look much brighter. The new company became a contractor of choice for some of the cranes required for Britain's nuclear reactors, including those at Heysham, Walther, Sellafield, Dounreay and Sizewell B.
"1991 was remembered by most people as the year of the big lifts. First off the ground were the turbine hall cranes, 4 massive beams, each weighing 130 tons and 65 meters in length. When coupled together, the cranes have the capacity to lift 320 tons. Their first task was to lift in the turbine house plant and equipment. The reactor building's huge polar crane was the heaviest lift of the entire construction program and was lifted in 5 separate sections, each lift taking just 2 hours to complete.
Position in the centre, so it is lifted without any movement either way. And then we just take the weight by radio control, read to the crane driver.
With the lifts we're doing just now, the stage that the reactor's at, is a lot of precise lifting. The crane is designed to position any of these big lifts within a few millimetres up, down, out or in.
Specialist cranes were made to load and unload bulk cargoes at ports, docks and factories worldwide. With the expansion of tourism and trade to the continent, Butterley Engineering became one of the main manufacturers of the roll-on, roll-off ramps and docking equipment which enabled lorries and cars to quickly drive on and off the newly introduced car ferries. The ramps and hoists had to cope with differing tide levels, and their installation, often in bad weather, was difficult and dangerous for the company's engineers. The roll-on, roll-off facilities built by the company are still in use at Dover, Heysham, Dublin and Belfast ferry ports. The company also built a range of mechanical handling equipment for the pits, quarries and bulk handling industries. It was also an early supplier of engine test rigs for Rolls-Royce. Once a completed and tested bridge, crane or large mechanical handling device left Ripley, it was Butterley's team of erectors who had the often dangerous job of erecting the product on site. In 1989, at a time of full order books, the spectre of takeover and investor speculation hit the company again, when Norcross sold out to Hayden McClellan Holdings, originally an agricultural parts supplier. Martin Mead, a multimillionaire financer and sometime director of Hayden McLaren, eventually acquired the company in 2000 as part of his Mead Corporation, changing the company name once again to Butterley Limited. Mead, now a Newmarket racing stable owner, specialised in buying what he called distressed companies with underperforming assets. Flying himself into a mass meeting of Butterley employees, he announced that although he usually bought companies to take them apart to maximise their assets, in Butterley's case he saw an opportunity to keep and develop the famous company. Buoyed by his apparent enthusiasm for the company, and with full order books and a contract to build what was to become Scotland's iconic Falkirk Wheel, the company appeared to have a promising future. If St Pancras Station was Butterley's supreme achievement in the 19th century, then Butterley's role in the construction of Scotland's Falkirk Wheel and later Portsmouth Spinnaker Tower must rank as the pinnacles of their 20th century history. Built as a Millennium Commission to connect 2 levels of canals in central Scotland and designed to move 4 boats an hour between the levels, Butterley won the £17 million contract to design, construct and test the wheel at Ripley prior to its final assembly. Transported on 35 lorry loads and hoisted into place, the 35-metre diameter wheel is designed to last for 120 years. The £78 million project was opened by Her Majesty the Queen in May 2002. Also built as a Millennium project, the steelwork for the 560 feet high Portsmouth Spinnaker Observation Tower was prefabricated at Butterley and assembled using its own erecting staff. Both the precision product itself and its erection showed, once again, the skills and abilities of the Butterley workforce. Sadly, it was to be the last of the company's iconic engineering achievements. By 2004, Martin Mead's promises to develop the company were beginning to look threadbare. The materials handling division closed with 30 job losses. Although orders continued to arrive, there was evidence of boardroom wheeling and dealing, with holding companies being closed down, only to be replaced with new holding companies with similar names. Rumours gained ground that Martin Mead intended to sell company assets and sell land for building. The workforce was kept in the dark about profitability or plans for the future, if indeed there were any. Once again, things were not good for the company and its workforce. and rumours were confirmed when Mead sold the top plane, where historically bridges had been assembled prior to dispatch, for housing. Allegedly, the company was then charged rent on its former land until the housing estate was completed. Official accounts suggest that Martin Mead dissolved what was known as Butterley Products Limited at the end of 2004. Who owned the company after that is not clear, but the writing was on the wall when orders were given to stop or delay the payment of invoices. Closure on the 3rd of August 2009 came as a surprise, despite orders still to be completed.
Putting a brave face on the recession, 2 engineering workers in danger of losing their jobs take their break by the roadside. Who are you actually waving to then?
Anybody that's come by.
Butterley Engineering, based at Ripley in Derbyshire, is now in administration.
We could see it coming really. We've been short to wait for about 2 or 3 months now, and we're just waiting for a call, really.
It's put it down to how things are in the country, can't wake up, and yeah, very shocked. And that's it. And there's about 15 of us left now, just clearing up what they wanted, and like I say, we've got a meeting this afternoon with them, with administrators, so we've just got to wait and see then.
What do you think's going to happen to the company then?
I think it'll just fold up and that's it. The end of a era, like, you know.
What do you think of that?
I think it's terrible, because my dad worked here, my mother worked here at Ward driving cranes, my uncle worked here, my granddad worked here, you know. Been part of the family really down here.
Such a big thing for the town.
Yeah, it is, yeah, it's a big thing, yes. Because it's got a lot of history, you see.
Demolition work commenced in September 2009, leaving only some pre-war listed buildings. So ends the story of the rise and fall of one of the industrial giants that made Britain great. Conceived by men of vision, born out of abundant local natural resources, made great by the brilliance of its engineers and the diligence of its workers, guided and cared for by the evangelical sincerity of Francis Wright and the 5 generations of the Wright family. For 219 years, its achievements helped move the world, from the days of horse transport to the technological environment we know today. Plagued by poor management decisions and later destroyed by asset strippers and the search for short-term profits, the Butterley Company is now no more. The district has lost its historic employer and Britain lost another of its industrial powerhouses. Martin Mead, the last owner, has largely withdrawn from the Mead organisation, resigning 119 of his 126 directorships to be more involved with his horse racing stud, while the derelict and depressing Butterley sites now await their futures.